This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans. Welcome back to Transparency, everyone. I am Aaron Terrell, joined as ever by my co-host Aaron Kimberly, but unusually it is just the two of us today. Aaron recently wrote a blog piece about kind of the experience he had in his local community and his family post kind of unstealthing yourself. A couple of years ago when we launched all of this stuff. And so, yeah, we just wanted to kind of give you the opportunity to tell more of how that all went down and yeah, how it's going now.
Yeah, it's parts of the story have been out there, but it's the first time that I kind of pieced together the whole story and some of the fallout. We were on Glinner's show some time ago, and Benjamin Boyce, talking about some of the activist backlash that I received as a result of speaking out against current practices in our healthcare system. But the part that wasn't told is just sort of how that unraveled and trickled through, rippled through my community and my family. So that's the part that we haven't really talked about yet. So would love to sort of hash that out a little bit.
Yeah. And I think it's really useful to give people that perspective. I know most of my angle in talking about all this all along has been, well, and most of my personal concern too. When I started doing this, my only concern was the backlash that you received was from the radical trans activist portion out there who would be obviously very much anti the stuff that we're doing and the stuff that we're talking about. And that's when I kind of like put all my personal socials on private and kept this just to Twitter and to the podcast and the organization and everything. As my concern was not actual transphobia. It was attacks from other trans people for speaking out. But you obviously, what you recently experienced is kind of the old-fashioned transphobia that to be honest, me in a kind of like really blue corner of the world has only ever been. I transitioned in 2012. It's literally only been, and the trans activists will also hate me saying this. It's only been social currency. It's only ever been. I mean, I was stealth for a while, but. I dropped it in job interviews, things like that, because I knew it was social currency. But you had a pretty different experience of all this. Being completely stealth for a very long time, and then unstealthing yourself as a result of the activism you were doing against the trans activists. Anyway, I'm kind of taking this over here, but yeah, if you want to kind of explain, like so I think it was your wife who was basically like, since you're putting this out in the public domain, we've got to kind of let the kids know, and kind of things went downhill from there. So
yeah, because I mean, I wasn't living in the trans community, and I hate that word, but I don't know what other word to use. But that wasn't my life, and that wasn't the point of transitioning. I didn't transition to be trans and identify as trans, and I didn't really feel like I fit within the whole, queer culture, and that so that just wasn't something that interested me. I just wanted kind of a regular white picket fence sort of life, and living in a small rural community. I grew up in a small rural community, and that's where I ended up again as an adult. And living stealth in a community like that isn't a necessity. And I was never dishonest with my wife about it. I mean, right early in our dating, during the period of dating, that was something that I was very open and transparent about. So it's not that I went in and was living this secret life or anything, but it wasn't something that I felt a need to go around sort of
Hmm.
announcing everywhere I go, right? I mean,
Hmm.
I'd reached a point in my transition. It's not even so much that I feel like I'm exactly, biological male. That wasn't ever my thinking. I think the transition worked in the sense that I just stopped thinking about gender. I just didn't
Hmm.
care anymore. It wasn't. I just was working and living my life, and gender wasn't really on my mind. And so I didn't really feel a need. I was functioning. I just didn't feel a need to go around announcing it everywhere. But in a small town, you pick up on attitudes and stuff from people, going to dinner parties or whatever, and someone would make a comment about trans stuff, and you kind of get a sense, okay, they're probably not going to be someone that I want to be close enough to tell
Hmm.
them my personal story. But things were happening in that little town, because of our liberal government and some of the trans activist mandates that they've started implementing. Um, it doesn't work in small communities. So one example is during our federal election, the election staff at the senior center, they were required. Sorry, my dog's distracting. They were so the staff were required. So if you weren't on their registry list, you could still vote as long as you had, brought ID or whatever. But one of their policies was they had to ask which sex you are. So if you can imagine, a small town, and it's a kind of a rough around the edges town, and a lot of truckers and bikers and loggers, very working class
Hmm.
guys being asked, "Are you male or female?"
Hmm.
And those kinds of policies and the culture war that's going on, and how ideas about what it is to be trans or queer or whatever, gay or whatever, the way that is being taught in throughout the educational system and through government programs and stuff, it's trickled out into small town farming communities where it doesn't fly, and
It's kind of kindling in the culture
it
war.
is kindling.
Yeah.
I mean, it ends up pissing people off and
Right.
and alienating us from our experience rather than helping them actually understand our experience and
Hmm.
and normalizing it that way. Instead, they're just making things very culturally weird, and it's actually, I think, driving transphobia um, in those communities, because they feel like their culture it is being threatened, and it is a kind of colonization. When it
Hmm.
starts to come from uh, um, high-end government, at the level of provincial or federal government, mandating these ideas, which really are coming from queer theory. It's
Hmm.
it's a kind of cultural colonization. We don't seem to learn through history when government imposes philosophical or political beliefs onto people, and the ways that that's actually destroying cultures throughout
Yeah.
Canada. And it's pissing people off, and they're blaming, when it's being done in the name of trans rights or LGBT rights, we're the ones that lands on our shoulders, right? That resentment and that hostility. And I
100%.
feel like that's actually getting worse and worse and worse. So, as trans activists are celebrating the successes of writing these things into law, it's actually making things a lot less safe for people that are just getting on with their lives in other communities. And they seem completely blind to that because they live within their own little echo chambers
Yeah.
where all of their friends are speaking and thinking the same way, but those
Yeah.
ideas don't translate outside of those echo chambers.
Yeah. Yeah. I I was I was of that milieu, not not like writing law or anything, but I was of that mindset that this is right, and like we can by will force people, force the hateful masses to, I don't, thinking long term, it makes no sense. But there's this sense of righteousness to it that really fuels you, and you know that this is right, and that these other people, they're ignorant and they're hateful, and we will win because we are right, and it's just so it, it, yeah it goes nowhere good because Yeah. Anyway,
And
you
and
were
you know,
obviously.
and the teaching and stuff about, there's 100 genders and all of that. That's being taught in elementary schools and middle schools, high schools in those small communities too. So these kids are going to school and learning about, the whole gender spectrum and that there's no such thing as boys and girls. And then they're going home and telling their parents, hey, this is what I learned in school. And so that's a part of it too, right? Is part of that mandate. I don't object to basic civil liberties. I think that is definitely something that had been worth fighting for, that we can't be fired from a job or beaten up or something because we're trans or gay or lesbian. So I agree with that stuff being mandated. Like, we need basic laws to protect people on that civil liberties level, but it's the Looney Tune lands that
Mhm.
they've gone into, right? Teaching these concepts that are cultural based concepts. They go, queer theory isn't natural law, and it doesn't help people to understand gender dysphoria and the different types of gender dysphoria and what our experiences actually are. It teaches this cultural stuff that not everyone is going to accept, and I really disagree with mandating those concepts into law. I think that's what's creating this culture war and this friction, and I don't think that's necessary for us to have civil liberties, because gender dysphoria impacts people from all different kinds of cultures, and we should get to choose our political affiliations. I mean, that's part of our freedom as people in North America, that we should have the freedom to vote for whoever we want to vote for, to have a faith or not. And why wouldn't we have all the same rights, human rights, as any other Canadian or American? So, trans activists are promoting this very culturally specific way of thinking that, for people that are trans and conservative or trans and Christian or trans and something, we should be able to integrate into our own communities, not have to, join this cult-like entity because we happen to have this condition. So what ended up happening is, because I felt like the activists had forced my hand, when I discovered what has been happening with our healthcare system, I felt I initially started speaking out within the clinical community, and that obviously it became very quickly apparent to me that that was not a welcomed conversation within, just the clinical community of practice. So that's really.
Could you briefly touch on that, like that what that was like, well, just for a second?
Yeah, so in terms of what I was connected to at the time, I was on a clinical listserv with community practice with other clinicians and some lawyers and various people with a vested interest in trans healthcare practices. So I was on that. So that was just for our province. I don't even know how many people were on that listserv. I'm guessing maybe a couple hundred. And so there was that, and there was weekly mentorship calls, and I guess that was the extent of it. I had some contact with the provincial health authority because they have a department that oversees how these medical practices happen, and they provide educational resources for both navigational support for trans people seeking these services, but also education for and supporting clinicians that are wanting to do the work. So it was, I guess it was on the clinical email listserv where I was expressing some of my concerns, because people were raising things like there was a question about Abigail Schreier, for example. They had just learned about her and were asking, hey, does anyone really know anything about her? She sounds really turfy to me. And I think I chimed in a little bit during that conversation that there are a number of people that are engaging in debates about ideology and how we think and understand these things that aren't necessarily they're not radical feminists, and they're not advocating for the exclusion of trans people. They're just concerned about the ROGD phenomenon and the healthcare system and the lack of assessment and speaking out about that. But anything that goes against the dogma, the orthodoxy of everything trans and queer automatically gets painted with a really broad brush. Well, that's just a turf. And so there was that conversation, and then later there was a conversation about what was happening in the UK with the Tavistock Clinic, and the temporary sort of ban after the judicial review that happened. So they put the pause on puberty blockers for young people. So that became part of the conversation. And I said, well, I actually agree with that. I think that's ethical to review the evidence. And so that, I think that's what caused the biggest
Okay.
the biggest stir. And so there was a big meeting at work, and then right at that time was when the Canadian Parliament was debating our conversion therapy law. And so
Yep.
once I kind of pieced all of this together, I mean, there were a lot of moving parts, and I was trying to, piece it together in a hurry. But that's when I realized, okay, so the activists are using legislation like our conversion therapy law as a way of codifying queer theory into law. So that, the way that our conversion therapy bill was written was talking about gender identity. They didn't even talk about gender dysphoria at all. It was all about this gender identity concepts, which is all just a political strategy and queer theory. But by writing it into legislation like that, so our legislation is written in a way that says that it would be illegal and up to a 3-year prison sentence for attempting to change someone's gender identity. So what does that mean? So someone comes in saying they identify as a frog or a tree gender. I mean, we now have all these ridiculous genders that have been totally fabricated by, Tumblr culture. So a counselor to explore that, what the meaning of that with a person, and potentially challenge them, that there's no such thing as a frog gender, that would be considered conversion therapy and illegal. So that has far-reaching implications. At the same time, I'm seeing and assessing these very, very vulnerable youth with multiple things going on, very complex presentations. They might have autism and come from, foster families and lots of trauma. And so these are the young people that I was assessing, while the trans activists are writing into law that I'm not really allowed to, explore with that client, what's really going on for them, with the potential outcome of them realizing, okay, this was indoctrination into a way of thinking, or I was, misunderstanding my autism symptoms. So there's so many different possible outcomes. So I was just really concerned about the ways in which that legislation would prevent us from doing really good clinical work with people. So that's when I came onto the radar of some of the local trans activists, and they, were making calls to my employer and trying to get me fired, which was very stressful. And that is what really lit the fire under my ass to start speaking publicly about this. But everything after that point, it just felt like my life unraveled, because the first thing that had to happen, and I don't blame my employer for this. I'm actually very grateful for my previous employer that they could have just fired me outright, for transphobia, but fortunately I think they knew me well enough, and they know I was able to talk to them about where I'm coming from. So I think they did move me out of that position. They felt that because most of what I was speaking to was how we're treating children and minors, that they felt like there would be a conflict of interest working with minors at the same time as advocating for what I was advocating for. So I get it, and in hindsight, it actually did, I think, protect me from anyone being able to claim there was a conflict of interest. But it was still stressful and disappointing, because I really loved working with youth, and I think I was doing good work with them, to have been removed from that position. So that was a strain. And then COVID hit, and I was working from home because of COVID, and so everything just started to unravel at that point, for me, and yeah, basically forced my hand to to come out and from being stealth, and like it hadn't landed in my local community yet. I mean, most of the work that we're doing is kind of international,
Hmm.
and so I don't know if anyone in the community ever would have stumbled upon our podcast or our website, but I guess there was that possibility, right? If anyone were to Google me, it probably would have come up. So there was a chance that someone in the community could have stumbled upon the work that we were doing. And there was a possibility that that meant that the kids could find out. And so my wife felt it was important to tell the kids so that that was coming from us, not from the community. But
Hmm.
the reason I hadn't told the kids, and it's not that I wanted to lie to them, but I think the reason why I had reservations about telling the kids was just that whole situation with their dad and how volatile he was and unstable he was, and how he was hell bent to find any dirt he could on us, any weapon he could use against us. And so I was concerned that I wouldn't be able to count on the kids to keep that private.
Hmm.
And I felt if they had taken that to their dad, it would escalate things, and that's exactly what happened.
Whether they found out directly or indirectly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then that kind of trickled out into your whole community.
It did, yeah, it trickled out into the community. I mean, I had no control over it at that point, right? I mean, the kids, they were going to tell whoever they were going to tell, and um, so once that information was no longer within my control, it just kind of spread, like a wildfire, and I could see changes in my relationships as a result of that, and and my fear about it too. I mean, that put a lot of pressure on me to feel like I was being outed, and had no control over who knew or what they knew or how information was being
Hmm.
presented to them. So that, I mean, I started to feel less and less comfortable in that community, and there is like a lot of transphobia and homophobia in communities like that. So it's a tightrope walk to do what we're doing, because on one hand, the trans activists are angry about what we're saying because we're breaking ranks and breaking away from the orthodoxy, and we're heretics in this
Hmm.
cult-like religion. So there's that, and we expected that kind of backlash because that was the initial backlash we got, and then we had the radical feminists like Katie, making videos about us saying absolutely awful things, and
Yeah.
then in the midst of that, I have this community and this family that's falling apart around me. So it's a tightrope because we're not making anybody happy,
Yeah.
and doing it because it's just the right thing to do.
Yeah. 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 It's kind of a triangle of animosity. But and like what you were saying about you were moved from your position working with youth when like you were obviously the one who was trying to protect them from the mandates from on high that was essentially just medical negligence effectively from the people who are purporting to care about them. um yeah it's kind of a microcosm of what's happening large scale with the trans activism versus the reality on the ground is that they everything they're doing is achieving the exact opposite of what they purport to want to achieve.
That was the frustrating thing about not being allowed to work with youth, is like I'm advocating for the safety of these youth. I'm advocating for really good care for these youth. And so to be told that I was somehow a danger or a harm to youth because of my position is just so backwards.
Yeah. Yeah.
And none of the complaints were coming from the youth themselves. I mean, as far as I know, like the work that we were doing was appreciated by the community. It's just that once the activists got hold of it, they started a campaign, and one of the activists was actually not a trans person herself. She's a mom of two trans kids and runs one of the parent groups. So I mean, that's a can of worms right there. But it's, she was one of the ones that locally was trying to boycott our clinic and telling anyone that came into our group, don't go to that center for anything. Don't go to that center. And that's really a disservice to these young people because we're doing good work with them. And we weren't a gender clinic. We were just a multi-service, multidisciplinary clinic for youth that youth could show up and we would assess what they needed and potentially help them in a lot of different ways, housing and the various social services, income services, mental health, primary care. So to tell youth, don't go to this clinic because of what Aaron is doing and they didn't fire him, therefore the whole clinic can't be trusted, is such a disservice to all of those youth who potentially would really benefit from the services we were providing.
Right, because the gender thing, that was just a small portion.
A very small portion of what the work that we were doing. But it was such an ideal. I was initially excited to do some of the trans care work there because there was such potential because we were a multi-service, multidisciplinary clinic. When youth came in, we could see them as whole people.
Right.
And connect them with all different kinds of services, while we were also talking to them about their gender dysphoria and those are their goals for that part. I mean, we had more than just the medical stuff to offer them, which I think is the ideal setup for this kind of work, because I mean, even if someone is going to go on a medical pathway, so let's say someone was going to get, double mastectomy. Well, they need a secure income in order to be able to do that. They need a secure place to live in order to do that. I mean, we can't send them to, the streets after surgery and expect that outcome to be good. I mean, they'd be at risk of infections and stuff. Or if someone was going to get, the genital surgeries done and let's say a vaginoplasty where they have to dilate on a regular basis, well, they need a clean, secure environment in which to do that. So even if we decided that the medical pathway was appropriate for somebody, there was still so much more that we could offer to support them psychologically. And, we were talking about really bringing in a lot of community service providers and doing things like yoga for stress reduction or massage therapy or, a lot of different kinds of services for these young people to really build them up and improve their mental health and their sense of social connection. And so we had big plans for what we could offer. And unfortunately, that kind of got all ripped out from under us.
Yeah, it sounds a lot more beneficial to the kids than what that article that just was released yesterday from the Free Press is like. Yeah, what you're describing versus what's going on for these kids in the U.S. is a very, very different story. Yeah, that's really sad.
Yeah, and then the model being described in that article, and we can link that to the liner notes too, so people know what we're talking about. But it was a very detailed insider view of how these clinics are operating, with basically no assessment that anyone can walk in and they're just given a prescription for puberty blockers or hormones with very little support or assessment or psychotherapy or anything. And that is the model that was really being pushed on how my clinic was supposed to be doing that work. And I refuse to do it that way. I mean, that way it wasn't, I don't really agree with doing that work with any age, like not even the fact that they were youth, but there are vulnerable adults as well who can get trapped in this and not really think it all through, or because of just their desperation to feel better, might be rushing decisions, might not have accurate information. Like there's still a lot of work that needs to be done with adults as well. And I remember 15 years ago or whatever it was when I transitioned, there was still a lot of support groups and psychotherapy options, and there was still a lot more services geared to us that I think were helpful. And I feel like all of that is being dismantled, that they want just every GP out there to just write these orders, whether they're competent or not. And then so you walk away with your hormones, but it's complicated. Transition is complicated, and it never stops being complicated. It's complicated. I mean, what happened with my family is part of the complication.
Mhm.
Living stealth, and even though my wife knew, and that was never a secret, I mean, it was still a strain on our relationship because I'm trying to fit into her community and her friends and her peer group, and not really feeling like I could ever really get close to them, because if they knew this about me, they would probably reject me. And so that was complicated. And then her feeling like, she was doing her best to understand and support me, but this wasn't her world, right? She doesn't come
Mhm.
from the queer community. And that was part of my attraction. I didn't want to be part of the queer community either. I just wanted to help her raise her kids and have a life together and build a life together. And so it wasn't for me. I didn't mind that wasn't her world. I didn't want to live in that world either. So I was doing my best to integrate into her world, and she was doing her best to support me. I did feel, at least in the first few years, I did feel well supported, and she has a big heart and was really trying to do her best to understand and support me. She went with me to Texas to support me through getting the metoidioplasty done, which I was so grateful for. And um, but she said that feeling like you have to keep a secret is a strain.
Mhm.
Even though she didn't feel like, it's not like she felt like ashamed and like it was a dirty secret, but it just to not be open about it, to not be able to tell people, because people would say, well, why did he have to go to Texas for surgery? Like, people ask questions, right, when things don't
Right.
really add up for them. And she didn't feel like she could just come out and say, yeah, this is the surgery he was having. Or, people would notice the scars on my chest and ask about them, because obviously I had surgery for something. And to feel like you can't just speak openly about it. I mean, that's a strain on anyone that lives stealth, but that strain and that the isolation that causes impacts those around us as well, not just ourselves. So that was something that was always ever present. But there's a reason why we do live stealth, and this is
Yeah.
the lesson you know that my wife learned, is when you start telling people, you can't control what they do with that information and what they think about that. And yeah, so it's like, what is worse, the isolation of not feeling like you can tell people, or telling people and now the whole community doesn't like you and doesn't respect you. And I wasn't the only trans person there either. There were, at least 3 other trans people in that area that I know of that are all live in stealth as well, for the exact same reason that I was, like, just trying to live their lives and working, and terrified that anyone would find out that they were trans.
You were obviously also seeing like like the youth coming into that clinic. They were locals, or how far were they coming? It's like, was this something? Because this is kind of harkening back to what you were saying. Like, there used to be services that were kind of like, when you were transitioning, that were intended to help people integrate as their goal gender, essentially, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
that was part of the transition process, was um, but that's shifted. So now it's not a case of, okay, how do we assist these people in transitioning from female to male to reintegrate into the world accordingly, or the opposite direction. Now it's that the whole purpose has shifted. It's like, how do we protect this trans person from these cis oppressors? So it's all about
Right.
like kind of stagnating that identity as trans, and then this whole us versus them, oppression thing. And I'm wondering, the youth that you were seeing, I'm wondering how many of them were because especially in that community, right? So they're in that small town environment, and like, how many of their ideas are coming from the internet, where they're being told you are trans and you have to basically fight the cis people around you, which in a lot of, like, in your community, that's entirely true, like
Yeah.
it, excuse me. And a lot of these kids who are absorbing these ideas are in metropolitan blue western cities. That's not that's not the reality.
Yeah.
But in a lot of in a lot of places, in North America, that is 100% the reality. But I guess, yeah, what was their, if you know, like, what was their thought process? Is like, okay, am I going to transition in this community and live as male or live as female, or am I solidifying this adopted trans identity, and how is that going to work in my small town community where it's only going to make my life exactly as hard as the activists are telling me it's going to be. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the clinic that I was working in wasn't in my small town. It was in a nearby city. So I had quite a commute to the
Oh, that
nearest
makes more
city
sense. Okay.
to do that. But our catchment area was just sort of in and around the city. But because there were so few services geared towards trans health, we were making exceptions to that. So we had people driving like 2-3 hours to come to us in order to receive the trans care services. And that was the only time we kind of made an exception to our catchment area rule. So we did have people coming from small towns and throughout the suburbs and stuff. And I think I would say I saw a mix where some I felt like had sort of the classic gender dysphoria, and they just wanted to live as the opposite sex and integrate into society. And I found with those ones, they didn't want to have anything to do with the trans community at all. Like, because we were trying to set up some peer groups for the youth, and I noticed that the ones that would probably end up become like transsexual, in the way that we use that word, that they just wanted to live as the opposite sex, blend in and just successfully live their lives. They were the ones that I don't think were indoctrinated into any of that. And they just had straight up gender dysphoria, and they just wanted to be more comfortable in their own skin. So those were the ones I noticed that they didn't actually benefit from the services that we were setting up, because they wanted nothing to do with all that queer theory crap.
Mm-hmm.
And seemed terrified of the idea of knowing other trans people, because the image of trans people out there is a bunch of, screaming idiots, right? So I actually felt like the healthiest kids that were coming in were the ones saying, why would I want to have anything to do with that culture? And so they got, they would get their hormones and disappear, and hopefully they have support in their lives, but certainly weren't benefiting from any of the services that we were creating to try to support them, which is a shame. And that's how I felt going through the system too, is like, I don't want to be part of a club. This isn't about
Right.
joining, if I wanted to be part of a club, I don't know, join the Lions Club or something. Like, I don't need a club or a new identity. So I didn't feel like I didn't go through many of the groups and stuff, because they were uncomfortable for me, because it was so much of that indoctrination stuff. So there were those kids, but I would say that they were probably the minority. And then there were kids that were obviously online and learning the queer theory stuff and coming in little groups to the clinic, three kids from the same school coming in together, asking for hormones, and very much into you could tell just by talking to them that their understanding of trans was the queer theory take, not the gender dysphoria take. But I didn't feel at liberty to, I'm not sure if I was even allowed to talk to them about what gender dysphoria is. I don't know if that's even permitted in this system anymore. So that became what the discomfort for me, right? Is you're seeing these people. It's like there was, I can't say any specific details, but there was one that was obviously psychotic. So that was a referral onto a different kind of service, and there were lots of different presentations. And you're being told, well, if you take the time to understand their story and what's kind of going on beneath the surface, that's gatekeeping, and that's not allowed. So that was the accusation. It wasn't even, the accusation from the activist wasn't even, you're doing unsafe work, you're doing, you're transphobic. The accusation was you're gatekeeping.
Right. So back then, originally, it wasn't even like the accusation of conversion therapy. It was just gatekeeping.
Yeah.
Right. And I
like
think
that was the sin, right? This horrible word,
right.
gatekeeping.
And I think that's what they realized is like they had to shift that language, and now they call it conversion therapy because they have to like because any normal, rational, ethical person like providing this care is gonna be like, okay, gatekeeping is kind of, that's a good thing. We want to, or as Buck puts it, safekeeping. We want to
Yeah,
stop people, getting medical treatment that's not right for them, that's not needed, that could ultimately harm them. And so they changed that to put it under the back under the queer banner of it's conversion therapy, to ask, where are these feelings coming from, what's your experience, yada yada. It's like to to ask those questions and to kind of dig, anywhere beneath the surface. It's like, oh, you're trying to change somebody from trans to cis, like you're trying to change from someone from gay to straight. And that, man, that branding has just worked so well.
I know.
Kudos. It's evil, but kudos.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the way that they're just kind of codifying this stuff in. And I mean, the city that I was working in, it wasn't one of the major metropolises. It was a smaller city, so a little more conservative, and hadn't been indoctrinated in the same way that maybe a larger center would be. So when the health authority came in and we're bringing in these ideas, and the mom that leads that group is kind of has close ties with that program. So was bringing in a lot of these ideas into a city and I felt like a lot of people in the city, it's like they're just not buying it. And I gave that feedback to the health authority. It's like you're bringing these ideas into communities because that's one of their, I think their goals is to increase access to services throughout the province. So going into like little northern communities and stuff, and trying to bring these ideas into those communities, it's not going to work in the same way that it's going to work in like a city like Vancouver.
And it does make sense. I mean, the backlash that we're seeing now is very much like using the words like groomer and stuff, because people very much feel like these ideas are basically being force fed to their children, and if they have anything to say about it, well then they're, we know this, but yeah, it's just a perfect example of the way you're describing it. Is I can now see so clearly how these people are feeling and why they're feeling it and why there's so much anger. And yeah.
Well, like First Nations communities, for example, but because the town I was living in was very close to a reservation, and the woman that I spoke to, it's now I'm living closer to her, but that woman I spoke to when I wrote that article about what Two Spirit means within
Oh yeah.
those
Yeah.
cultures. I mean, I think they're really feeling the impact of these queer theory indoctrination that's being imposed by our government now. Is that isn't consistent with the ancient cultural understanding of what Two Spirit meant. So it's Two Spirit has now been added to the LGBTQI this and never ending list of letters. So Two Spirit is now, you often see that in that list of letters, where and you see news reports and stuff about this intentional movement to queer some of these northern communities where a lot of the First Nations are. So
it's cultural appropriation.
It is. It's cultural. It's taking Two Spirit.
Oh, yep, you're back. Yep.
It's, adding the Two Spirit onto this queer project, but at the same time going into these communities and teaching queer theory rather than the ancient understanding, cultural understanding of what Two Spirit meant, which was part of their spiritual beliefs. So I think some of the First Nations are feeling the impact of that it is a cultural appropriation all over again, while our government is trying to apologize for having culturally appropriated them in the past, is now doing a whole brand new cultural appropriation, shoving this academia, these ideas that came from academia, shoving that into these communities, and the impact on the communities and the overrepresentation of First Nations people being medicalized for that thing, because now they're being taught that this new model of understanding those experiences of gender nonconformity and sexual orientation. So rather than them understanding that through their own cultural lens, are now understanding it from a queer theory lens and are definitely, you know, in our when they do surveys on the community, you can see the number breakdowns of where these people are coming from and their nationality, their ethnicity, and First Nations people, at least here in Canada. I don't know if it's the same in the States, but here in Canada, First Nations people are overrepresented in those who are identifying as trans.
Oh, really? Hmm. I don't know if that's the case in the U.S. But I'm wondering too, though, if that has something because there's an overrepresentation of, well, there's at least in the U.S. there's a lot of First Nations, or we say Native Americans, uh, people in the foster care system, and I'm wondering if that's a correlation rather than a cultural one.
Mm-hmm.
It's a case of yeah, that same kind of
Trauma and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, because there's a lot of obviously at least in the US, a lot of we don't. I mean, that's going into a different story, but like alcoholism and stuff, and just like generational poverty and things like that. That they're the same things that affect all communities in that can lead people to yeah to yeah seeking yeah a solution and calling it trans. So
Now we have that First Nations Canadian transsexual woman speaking out, feeling that she was rushed through medicalization and now regrets her surgery and has applied for medically assisted death because of that trans regret, and is now speaking out about what is essentially the sterilization of First Nations young people.
what are those numbers? Do you know?
I don't remember offhand, but I remember when I saw the survey. So I took that percentage and kind of compared that to the national percentage. Because I mean, if this is gender dysphoria, you would think this would be evenly
Hmm.
distributed among people, right? So, and that's when I realized that First Nations were overrepresented, as was I think foster care. And there have been studies about that. About I think it was an Australian study about the overrepresentation of kids in foster care identifying as trans.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think they did have a stat on the Canadian survey about immigrant families, and that seemed overrepresented compared to I looked up, what percentage of our population are immigrants, and that was overrepresented in the trans care stats as well.
Interesting. That really surprises me, actually. Huh. Okay.
But I wonder if that's all part of just, you know, trauma, stress. I don't know what that would be about. So it's hard to read into kind of why these things would happen, but it is. I think it's alarming when you do see that, though. Like, why would
Hmm.
gender dysphoria? I mean, if we kind of take it out of that queer theory framework and back into reality, right? This is
Hmm.
gender dysphoria. Why would we see an overrepresentation of gender dysphoria in foster kids or immigrant kids or kids of other races and nationalities?
Well, I definitely with foster care, I definitely see it as likely resulting from abuse, right? Um, uh, uh, and then a need of a community, right? Need of yeah, like a community group to belong to. And I think, well, I'll get back to that, but uh, with the kind of more like maybe immigrants coming from a more conservative who have a more conservative kind of culture that they've left or that their family still like I'm wondering if that's more to do with homophobia, right? I'm wondering if in these small minority communities it has more to do with transitioning out of homosexuality, right? I'm wondering if that could be those numbers. That would make sense to me. Um, I don't know that if that's the case with in First Nations peoples. If yeah, if homosexuality is much more taboo than it is
Mm-hmm.
in more Western cultures. Well, obviously that's what I mean. But like, I wonder if that has some bearing there. Whereas I think with a lot of the kids who that like, I'm guessing that a lot of the kids that you were seeing, like in the cities, those are basically all white kids, right? Like white teenage girls is my take on it. And I think, and those like so at least the ones who who are seeking out the services that are provided. Like you were saying, there was the kids who were transitioning and very much just wanted, and they wanted to just transition. They didn't want anything to do with the queer community stuff. I think those are the ones who have a sense of community, a sense of belonging, a sense of culture. And then the people, this has been my perspective anyway, the people who are transitioning and clinging on to that kind of queer theory stuff and wanting the whole trans thing. It typically, I feel like it's a need of community, a need of sense of belonging. Like you said, you didn't need the club. I didn't need the club. Some people need the club.
Yeah.
They're in it for the club, you know.
Yeah, and I definitely picked that up
yeah,
from assessing some of these youth, right, where they described histories of being very, very lonely. I mean, a lot of them had autism or ADHD where they struggled socially and were very lonely kids. And it's like, yeah, there's this club that I can join as long as I kind of play along with the orthodoxy, then I get to belong with these other quirky kids. So I definitely picked up on that with some of them. And I did keep stats on just the youth that I assessed. And it was a small sample because it was just the youth that I saw, but it mapped onto, when you see those graphs of the demographics that we're seeing from all over the world, like Tavistock Clinic, and where that sex ratio flipped. So just a little snapshot of like that year that I was doing the work and assessing these young people, that the trends that I saw in that population mapped perfectly onto what seems to be happening everywhere in the Western world, where it's mostly white, gay, or bisexual girls.
Okay.
Who had autism, abuse histories, were in foster care, very complex. So it's just, I could, and I just feel like the queer theory contingent of how, that has control over how this care is being done, they seem to celebrate those numbers. It's like, yes, how can we even get more? How can we, like, I know our health authority had this survey that they were trying to get, every clinic or practice out there using this intake screener to try to identify who are the trans kids before they even identify it for themselves, which in other areas of medicine is good practice, right? You want to try to catch things as early as possible and intervene because that's where your best outcomes are, right? If someone had diabetes, you want to catch it early before damage is done to your body. So it's that way of thinking, is how can we find these kids and be more proactive in finding these kids, so that you're not even waiting for them to come to a clinic saying, I want these interventions, but how do we catch them on intake in all these different clinics and disciplines so that we can intervene early? How is that not recruitment? Like, it's just, it's frightening.
Yeah.
But so they celebrate the fact, like, yes, these were all these people that weren't receiving any help before. And so they celebrate these rising numbers, rather than thinking critically about why are these numbers rising and why would certain races or certain trauma backgrounds or certain other diagnoses, why would we be seeing an overrepresentation of those populations? Which I looked at those numbers and I felt alarmed by those numbers, but they seem, because this ideology is so blinding, they're not able to think critically anymore. And that is what's created this perfect storm of very unsafe care. And that's why I speak out. That's why you speak out. I'm glad to see more and more people speaking out, like this, that former case manager at that clinic, a beautifully, articulated snapshot of what's happening in these clinics. And it absolutely is medical malpractice. But you and I, and just sort of talking personally about my story and some of how it did unravel my life. I mean, we kind of talked about that and decided that might be helpful information to put out there to the world, that there is a cost when you speak out against this orthodoxy. And yes, we were expecting the backlash from those that are pushing that ideology, but also balancing that with the actual transphobia that we experience. So I think we're in a sort of a double bind when we speak out. And yet I think we have potentially the strongest voice in this because I mean, you said it beautifully in an email to that clinician that is speaking out, that the left won't listen to the right. So I think the right has caught on to this problem, but the left because they're political opponents, they're always going to butt heads, right? So it's when, you know, gay, lesbian, and trans people start speaking out about this, I think it's really going to shift that needle. But some of the backlash we received from like the feminist contingent, they don't want us to get any of the credit for shifting that needle, right?
Hmm.
So we do see, this very vicious
Yep.
transphobia backlash too. It's like, no, you get
Yep.
in your place and shut up about this, because we don't want the world to know that any of you are sane or that any of you care about other people, and we don't want you to get any of the credit for speaking out about this. So we
Yep.
get it from all sides, right?
Yep.
But
Yeah.
what I really wanted to drive home in our talk today was just, this impacts more than just you or me. Like this impacted my entire family, and I do think we were at one point certainly not a problem-free family. And as I described in that statement, there were challenges that we were facing as a family that were pretty brutal and stressful for all of us. But we were a loving family, and we were doing work together that was really, I think, set the kids up for success. In the first 3 years that we were together, we saw amazing improvements in the mental health and stability of these kids, and that is what these trans activists have damaged. Is they ripped apart not just me, but ripped apart an entire family, and I'm pissed. I'm angry about that it's impacted the trajectory of those kids' lives because of this bullshit, because of the trans activists and because of transphobia, those things coming together and, converging on a point of destroying a family that was on a healthy trajectory. And I hold them accountable for that.
Yeah, these two, it's just like when you talk about war, and you talk about these competing motives of those on high, and it's yeah, the people on the ground who are actually damaged, who are actually being hurt by yeah, sorry, I lost that train. I didn't lose the train. I lost the ability to articulate it. So my
Yeah, people
apologies
get so
there.
caught up in the Twitter wars and stuff and forget that there are real people just trying to live their lives and figure this stuff out and do the right thing. Right. And it becomes like some of the feminists that I interacted with online, that were spewing just this awful hatred, saying this is a war. This isn't a time for niceties. It's like, you know what? You're hurting real people.
Right, right.
And then even Posey Parker at one point, and she didn't name us, but she was obviously talking about us and Gender Dysphoria Alliance, and saying that basically saying any trans parent is an abusive parent just because they're trans. It's like, you were saying that at a time where I was battling for my kids' safety and well-being in court and against an abusive father and all of that. That's where I was situated within my family, is going to bat for these kids, while this idiot who's never met me in the UK blasting that just by being trans, I was somehow
Yeah.
doing harm to these kids. No, it's all this political shit that caused harm to my
Hmm.
kids.
I always like I say on and on, like we're like there are so many more sane, reasonable trans people who see what's going on, and they don't say anything about it. And I have a lot of uh not anger, but it definitely frustrates me. It's like I know there's so many more of you and I out there, and of Mars and Buck, and of you know Debbie and Corinna, and like there's so many of us out there that are completely silent. And when when I hear the details of everything that went down for you coming out and speaking out, it's like, well, no shit, they shut up and keep their heads down. And yeah,
Because
I
if they're in the trans community, it'll be immediate loss of community if they start speaking out.
yeah,
And if they're
yeah,
not living in the trans community, they could face the transphobia from whatever community they're surrounded with. So it does I get it. I get why
yeah.
people aren't. either don't understand what's happening. I mean, most of the friends that I had in that around that community who are, living stealth trans guys, just, happily married or whatever they're doing, right? Doing their job and just living their life, and they're actually unaware of how weird things are getting, like,
Right.
out there, right? So a lot of them are just completely oblivious to what's happening too.
Yeah.
But they would, it is a huge. The stakes are high for even if they did understand it. I did talk to some of them about what's happening, and they're like, "What, really?" Like, they were shocked, and so it's not that they don't care, they just don't know. But if they know, yeah, the stakes are pretty high for them to take the risk to, to out
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
And there's no going back. Once that information is
Yeah.
out,
Yeah. You can't
you
put it
can't
back.
you
Yeah.
can't put it back in the box.
Yeah. 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 I feel like I was like, this required no sacrifice or courage on my part. And I'm like, so I've lost, not like I've told you about this plenty. It's like I've lost nothing, but I've gained a lot. So so for me, it's easy to be like, why doesn't everybody, like, if you got this on your conscience, just speak up. But for me, it's only been like, yeah, it's only been a net positive, because that's it. I came from a community that was very, very far left, but I'm not like in a community sort of. I mean, I've got, like, friends around me, but they're pretty normal, like, not politically. I mean, they're, typical lefty, but not. They're not the new left. They're not, for lack of a better word, woke. They're just, what we used to know as, just general, uh, Western conservative or Western liberals, excuse me. Um, and I knew, some people will obviously find out a lot about me that I don't want them to know. I mean, I'm obviously out here just you know saying, like, the most personal and private details of my life, but it's like, and that's not comfortable, but I know it's useful, and all it is a discuss, like, it's, yeah, it's like I feel a little bit naked a lot of the time, but it's like I'm not really losing anything. No, I've never been, concerned about my physical safety. Never thought that it would cost me legitimate, and like real, family and friends. Like, I've never. So yeah, your everything that happened to you is kind of helped me put into perspective. It's like what people can lose, what you lost, what a lot of other uh, trans people, will lose by trying to take on this war. Because yeah, it is, it's coming at us from three ways, because yeah, you got the trans activists who want us to shut the fuck up, get in line, and and the vitriol, like, just the animosity is
Mm-hmm.
just so bad from them. And then you've got the the radical feminists who say we're groomers just by existing, just by speaking. um, and then and then you've got, the vast swaths of the rest of the world that are like, yeah, they also think we're groomers and predators for existing. And uh, yeah, so I can understand why people just shut up. I just don't have I don't have that shut up functionality in my brain. So yeah,
It's not in my nature to walk away from a car crash, right? Like, when I'm in a helping profession. I mean, I couldn't see what was happening, and just,
right.
how do you ignore that? Like, once you sort of see the damage being done to potentially thousands of young people, how do you just, I couldn't.
Yeah,
It's just not in my nature to say, I'm not, I guess I could have just said, I'm just personally not going to do the work, and I'll just shut up about it. But it's just not in my nature to see such a problem on such a large scale that has the potential to damage so many people. I can't just forget about that. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night.
right,
But I
right.
do, part of me does feel kind of resentful that, yeah, what it's cost me, like, that I didn't want trans to be the center of my life, and here I am talking about
Right.
trans all the time. That's the last thing I wanted to do, right? Is to come back and talk about
Yeah,
trans stuff all over again, and lose everything that I had built and created, you know, t in order to speak up. But yeah, so
yeah,
it's been frustrating, it's been painful, it's been stressful, it's been a lot of things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I obviously immensely appreciate it. And I know, yeah, hundreds and ultimately thousands of people do as well. So yeah, I know it's no consolation for yeah um, yeah everything that you've sacrificed and lost, but it's it's gonna have shut. I can't when I'm emotional. I can't string words together. So anyway,
Uh,
anyway,
it's lit a fire under my butt even more, though. So, I mean, if the trans activists thought that by lashing out at me that they were going to shut me up, I'm even more pissed now because they didn't just
right.
hurt me; they hurt my family, they hurt these kids. Um, so I'm definitely not going to be backing down now. And part of why I was holding back too was because I didn't want it to impact my kids. I wanted to shelter them from how awful and
Disruptive.
vicious this whole and disruptive this whole thing is. So I didn't. So I kind of held back in order to shield them. I didn't want any of the backlash sort of blowing onto them. Which is why changed my name on social media and did my best to kind of protect them that way and create a little bit of a shield and shelter. So now that they're out of the picture, they're not
Nothing to
dependent on
hold
my
back.
income. They're not dependent, right? So nothing to hold back, nothing left to lose. So there's that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Good work. Good work, trans activists. uh,
But I wanted to mention too, the one I mentioned it in the article too, that one of my wife's friends left me a nasty message on my Facebook wall this past week. And, that frustrates me too, because I know it sounds like, so she has a daughter that's trans identified. And from what I don't really know them. So, but from just what I've heard and, peripherally, that daughter does sound like she fits the ROGD profile. So it's
mm,
really, and I know that friend of my wife's is getting, it sounds like she's getting a lot of, accusations of, well, you're a bigot because you're not supporting me as your trans daughter and blah, 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 which is sort of the typical ROG narrative, right? Where it comes out of nowhere and parents say, well, I don't think that's what's going on for you. And then they get smeared as a bigot. So it's frustrating for me that I'm getting that kind of vitriol from that friend, while I'm hammering out how to protect kids like hers.
yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like she she kind of is exactly what the ROGD kids and their enablers are accusing these parents of. It seems like she's like uh, actually a transphobic bigot. So there's that.
Yeah.
All right, should we wrap it up?
Yeah.
Gotta get
Adventures
over to
and
Laura.
Adventures in activism.
Yeah, that's what we should title this.
Yeah. Yeah. So thanks for the chat. It's nice. I mean, I wrote the article and that sort of describes a lot of the details, but I really wanted us to just have a conversation about it and talk a little bit about the spirit in which we decided to kind of put that information out there publicly. And it wasn't about airing my dirty laundry, or it's not even about sympathy. It's just about, I wanted people to understand that there is a cost to speaking out publicly about this stuff, and a reminder to people that there are real people
Yep.
behind the screens. It's not just a Twitter war. It's not just a social media war. It's not just a culture war. That there are real people involved in this, trying to have the conversation and do the right thing. And we're not just individuals. We're part of a whole system and a network and families that end up getting hurt by this as well.
Yeah, exactly.
All
Yep.
right.
Thank you for telling it.
Till next time.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.